Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program the Washington Bureau Chief of The Intercept, also the co-host of the Breaking Points podcast and YouTube show, the Unrepentant journalist who, according to The Guardian, Jesse Waters mixer-upper, as it were.
Never repent.
Ryan Grimm, welcome back to the program. I'm just referencing a Guardian story that I read today by Ramon Antonio Vargas, the title of which is "Journalist Unrepentant Over 2016 Fracas" with Fox News host Jesse Waters. I remember covering this at the time. And I think I mentioned this the other day about what Jesse Waters did in sort of like, I don't know, semi-stalking Amanda Turkle. But will you just reiterate to us what you're unrepentant about?
Well, yeah, Turkle wrote a blog post back in like 2005 or 6, like 7, something like that, critical of Bill O'Reilly. She reached out to him for comment, and he didn't respond to request for comment. Instead, he told Jesse Waters, go get her. And Jesse Waters gets in his car with his little camera crew and chases her 2 hours into Virginia. And they finally catch up to her on the street, some small Virginia town. They catch up to her on the street and put a camera in her face. And she's just completely bewildered. Like, what on earth is going on here?
Right.
Like, this is somebody who reached out to speak with them. It's not as if she was dodging them. They were literally dodging her. So they just try to get some. And I presume that they didn't realize she was going on vacation, and they got like 15 minutes outside of DC. And at that point, they can be like, you know what? Let's turn around. This is getting weird. Instead, they plowed forward and followed her for 2 hours out into Virginia.
And also, I mean, the point is that like, it's not like they contacted her and say, we want your reaction to this. There was no attempt. It was clearly
toward her attempt to get them to comment.
Right. I mean, there was clearly no journalistic purpose to this. It was clearly, and in fact, I think on the footage from your conversation with Waters, he says, Bill wanted me to go after her, so I went after her. I mean, it was literally just, Bill O'Reilly with almost like his personal hit squad. And we should say, Tucker Carlson continued this in the same way, and not necessarily maybe sending out stringers, although I don't know, I didn't watch enough of it, but he certainly would target people.
He would do it in his show, whereas Bill O'Reilly's kind of innovation was he'd send somebody to the professor's like front door.
Right.
And Jesse would like put his foot on the door and like jam the camera into the living room and stuff like that.
And so you're at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2016. I was not in attendance. I never have gone to that.
We were at the MSNBC party. You should have been there.
No, I don't get invited to those.
You were a contributor at the time.
I probably was, but I don't.
He has to keep a low profile.
I got to keep a low profile.
Ryan,
Isn't this thing on Is this thing still on Peacock?
No. We had to end that relationship.
Right.
But that's another story. But so you went up to Jesse Waters. Let's just play a little bit of a clip of it. And just for the heck of it.
She'd come over here. Would you apologize? No, but bring her over. I just want to say hi. I ambushed her because O'Reilly told me to get her because she said some really bad shit. What'd you say? I know you're videoing. Oh, of course I am. She denigrated some rape victims, so we had to call her out.
All right. And to be clear, all right, we don't need... She didn't denigrate some rape victims. It's actually the opposite, as far as I can remember. And
of course it is.
And oddly enough, Amanda Turkle was not denigrating rape victims.
Believe it or not.
It's really shocking. And so this goes on, and Waters gets a little bit upset that you're videotaping him, which is sort of ironic.
That's the whole joke. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And he grabs your phone and keeps it in his pocket. And then what happens?
Well, first he throws it and I went and picked it up, and it was still filming. And I come back and put it back in his face, and I guess I want to comment on why he had just thrown the phone. Then he takes it and puts it in his pocket.
Are you in a tux, Ryan, at this point?
I'm sure. I bet we were.
Everyone's.
Yes,
I just love I
yes.
love the visual of like media personalities scuffling in tuxes.
Now, Jesse Waters is a fairly big guy. He's like, I would say he's about 6'2", maybe.
6'2", 6'3".
Oh, he
like
could play a villain like in like a frat house or something when he was younger. He has that energy.
He's also ripping a cigarette in this video.
Oh.
Right.
Right.
But Ryan, you're also a pretty big guy.
Good 6'1". Yeah.
Yeah. And so he takes the phone, and then what happens? All I remember is him saying like, "Step off me," or get step off me in some way.
Yeah, because he was telling me that he was going to like he might mail the phone back to me like next week or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no. Like that is absolutely not happening. And so I think you can hear this part in the video. I warned him. I'm like, give it back, or I'm going to take it back. And he's like, get off me. I'm like, I'm going to take it back. And then I went to grab it. And then that's when a very brief fight broke out, because there's so many people there.
Right.
That it's within 5 seconds, it's like broken up. But Ken Vogel, to his great credit, was able to snatch it out of Jesse Waters' hand.
The phone.
Yeah. Jesse, you could see like after we got pulled apart, Sean Spicer actually is the one who like pulls us apart.
Wow.
And as after we're pulled apart, you can see him trying to go into the phone. What Ken thought he was doing was trying to delete the video where he had said, "Oh, Bill sent me to go get her." But Ken got it out.
Vogel is now a Times reporter.
Right. Yeah. He was Politico at the time. Yeah. And so he and I started at Politico the same day in 2006. Which wasn't even Politico yet. Anyway, so he got it out of his hand before he could delete it.
Oh, sweet. He was trying to delete that. He wouldn't have been able to fully delete it because he would have had to go into your deleted video.
Then delete and then delete. Yeah.
You can't do that easily. And so it sounds like you're unrepentant over this.
Unrepentant.
Yeah. Well, I just want.
That's what it means to be a mighty man of valor.
Are we not going to see the rest, though? We're not going to see the rest?
People can go, look at it. I mean, it really is just like a 6-minute confrontation.
Oh, it's 6 minutes? Okay,
all right.
Yeah. Well,
and then all the good stuff happens like you don't see it because
the phone's in his
pocket.
All right. Well, selfishly, I just hadn't seen it before, but I'll check it out after the show.
Yeah, it's worth watching, but good for you. All right, let's get to some, with all due respect, more serious news. This week started. Well, I mean, I guess there was an invite to the Israeli president to speak before Congress. There about 5 or 6 people in the House boycotted it. Earlier in the week, Pramila Jayapal was at Netroots Nation and had said Israel is a racist country. She had to walk that back, or I think she would argue clarify and say, well, the idea of Israel is not racist, but the policies are racist today and apartheid. I mean, it is, I think, fairly uncontroversial to say that there is apartheid in that country now. I think people could argue that the founding of the nation was racist or not. I mean, it's certainly a colonial project. And it's very hard to have a colonial project where there isn't some racism that's associated with that. But the idea that it's apartheid, it seems uncontroversial at this point. And so give me your sense of like what the implications of all this has been, because it's been going on for a long time. And I know you've done a lot of reporting on how AIPAC plays in Democratic primaries in this last thing. And it's really significant.
And the latest news on this, just about an hour ago, Jewish Insider reported, based on a source within or close to AIPAC, that they are now recruiting a primary challenger to Jamal Bowman.
Yeah.
This guy, Westchester County Executive Latimer, you might know this guy, and are encouraging him to run because Bowman voted against this resolution that stated three things. Anti-Semitism and xenophobia are bad, which I was really surprised that Republicans threw in xenophobia on that. Like,
right.
who was asleep at a switch there? Like, wait, you're against the whole MAGA movement now? But anyway, so anti-Semitism bad, xenophobia bad. Israel is not racist. Israel is not apartheid. Like, that's number 2 on the House resolution there. And then number 3, Israel and the United States will always be allies, basically no matter what. Like, just no qualifications, just Israel's strong ally of the United States strong ally of Israel. Bowman was one of 9 people to vote no on that resolution. And so AIPAC wants to jump in now and see if they can primary him. He had a primary challenge last time and won fairly comfortably. He, of course, beat Eliot Engel, who was the House Foreign Affairs Committee chairman and one of the most kind of outspoken advocates for the AIPAC hawkish line in Israel. So AIPAC has wanted to take him out, since he upset Eliot Engel in that primary. And I think what they were extremely bothered by is that Bowman beat Eliot Engel in a lot of, and I think you probably know this district fairly well, a lot of heavily Jewish precincts went for Bowman. And that is something that is scary to AIPAC politically, when the gap between not just what the American population generally thinks, but what the Jewish population in the United States thinks about AIPAC is so wide that they can't even hold the foreign affairs chair's seat against somebody who's at the time was kind of mildly critical of Israel. This is Jamal Bowman is, he's somebody who, he says he supports Israel. He supports Israel's right to exist. He just supports, human rights and dignity for Palestinians living under Israeli control. And that right there is too much for AIPAC.
The reality is that about 75% of the Jewish population agrees, if you were to believe polling, agrees with Bowman's position on this. Mm-hmm. Now, Engel was also, uniquely sort of like asleep at the wheel. Yes. I think at one point, like, he was caught on tape as saying, like, at some, I can't remember what the event was.
It was a Black Lives Matter rally.
Right.
This happened at the height of the George Floyd protests. And he's like, can I please speak? Can I please speak? And they're like, no, because there's so many politicians here. We can't have everybody speak. He's like, look, if I didn't have a primary, I wouldn't be asking to speak.
Yeah,
I wouldn't even be here if I didn't have a primary.
I wouldn't even be here. It was a hot mic. I remember that. That was amazing.
And it's on like New York One, and I wouldn't even be here if I didn't have a primary.
Right.
This is, I think, there's a couple of things, involved in that dynamic. One, the really intense sort of blind, if you will, unconditional support of Israel comes more now, I think, from the Christian Zionist community than it does from broadly the Jewish community. Because the Jewish community is, on a whole, far more willing to be critical of Israel's policies, at the least. And so you start to see, this is where, the Republicans are, why they are so vehemently supportive of Israel. The other thing that's sort of fascinating is that this notion of equating, this is what Trump did, right? And frankly, Bobby Kennedy did at his hearing yesterday, equating lack of anti-Semitism or support for Jews with support for Israel is sort of fascinating.
Right. Yes. And you see a ton of it on the right now. And I think because so much of the base for this on the right is these Christian Zionists, that allows so much genuine, real anti-Semitism to become also part of the conversation. That's why you can have, who's that white supremacist, Nick Fuentes?
Oh, yeah.
That spoke recently, like practically celebrating the Holocaust at a fairly mainstream kind of Republican event. You've got Trump saying like outwardly anti-Semitic things, but then they say, well, I support Israel. So that's sort of like my get out of anti-Semitism card free. They feel like they can just say whatever they want because they so strongly support whatever Israel does unconditionally. It's kind of the reverse of saying that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. Kind of the flip side of that is, any anti-Semitism is fine as long as you're supportive of the most far-right government in Israel, no matter what it's doing.
And will you just remind us, I mean, the implications of AIPAC going at Jamal Bowman, the last cycle was scary for a couple of reasons, because what we saw, the AIPAC, and I can't remember the name of the group. The
DMFI?
Yes.
Democratic Majority for Israel.
Exactly. Yeah. And they just had some event out in California. I saw they have been going into primaries and really targeting progressive challengers or incumbents. And I think they had a pretty good track record last time. They failed in terms of Summer Lee, but they did well with a couple other candidates.
Yeah.
Just recap that for us, but also the problem with their being successful in that, and also speak to who's funding them. The problem with their success isn't even limited to those particular races, but rather it's almost created a blueprint or a template for attacking progressives.
Yeah. And so, right, they beat Nida Alam in North Carolina, spent millions against her, beat Erica Smith, spent millions in North Carolina, spent like $7 million beating Donna Edwards in suburban Washington and Maryland. And then, like you said, a number of other candidates kind of either walked or sprinted away from previously held positions in support of Palestinian rights. You had Maxwell Frost down in Orlando, who went from a supporter of BDS to calling BDS racist within like 6 months or something, hoping that this AIPAC and DMFI money wouldn't flood into the race. I interviewed his challenger, who had been endorsed by AIPAC, and he's like, "Where's all the AIPAC money? I thought I was going to get all this AIPAC money." He'd gone to two AIPAC trips as a Florida state senator on AIPAC's dime, and didn't come in because he had kind of assuaged them. But in order to assuage them, a lot of these progressives also have to kind of back away from the general kind of progressive agenda, because Medicare for all, Green New Deal, support for Bernie Sanders, those kinds of things have been lumped in with, oh, well, then you're probably supportive of Palestinian rights too.
That's how AIPAC is going to try to, that's their next the new frontier, which is that if that divide is becoming more pronounced that you describe, Ryan, about the way that Jewish people are voting in districts that are, traditionally more heavily Jewish, and there's that schism between what AIPAC is promoting and how that population is going to be voting in a primary, then they have to put dark money into groups that are going to attack them on other issues, like Medicare for all, Green New Deal, that would also have like a high degree of correlation with also support for Palestinian rights. And
sometimes they'll even lie about that from the reverse angle. They spent a couple $1 million to beat Nina Turner in that special election in Ohio, and they were sending out mailers saying that she opposed a $15 minimum wage because she had voted no on the DNC platform, because she had tried to get the wage higher and had other problems with the platform. So they're like, Nina Turner voted against universal health care and against a $15 wage. And then in other places, they'll call her like crazy and on and on. Yeah, but none of the ads ever focus on Israel-Palestine, ever.
And also we should say that I think part of it is that where their funding comes from, that may be part of the sort of strings attached to the funding.
It's it's private equity, hedge fund, other super wealthy money that is hostile to the general progressive agenda. They don't want higher taxes. They don't want Medicare for all. They don't want a Green New Deal. So, if you can funnel it through this, then it's effective.
And the problem with their success is, again, not just the candidates that they take out, but also that it's sort of like, what do you call it? It's the proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
And so to lose in this fight with Jamal Bowman is going to be a big fight, it seems to me, because if you can show the limits of the value of their money, it's going to be harder for them to go back to these people and get more money, because as wealthy as these people are, they don't want to go out and spend money and not get their results.
Right. That's right. And AIPAC has been very good at creating fear around them coming into races. In the 1980s, that's how they basically set the template for this model that we're going to take out. We have the power to take you out. And so we don't have to spend money. We would prefer not to spend money, but
we discipline you with the
Yeah.
idea that we might do it. And that's the way that it happens. I mean, that's the sort of like, I think the part of the calculation that people don't fully understand when we talk about money in politics. It's also, and I think, Sheldon Whitehouse, sort of explained this to me years and years ago. He's like, the other, or maybe it was Franken actually, would talk about, like, the fear is not just that someone's going to spend money for your opponent, that they're going to come in and deploy money against you. And so you're part of what changes your sort of like public pronouncements are to avoid that thing. Someone on the IM just asked why House resolutions matter. It's almost exclusively about elections. I mean, almost, right? In this instance, so that they can go out and say, Jamal Bowman voted against this. I mean, that's why the Republicans, when they control the House, and Democrats do this too, not as effectively, I would argue, in like sort of putting up sort of wedge issue resolutions. Yeah,
and it's a signal of power, and it's similar to the Iron Dome vote. Like, if you remember that Iron Dome vote, which Bowman was criticized by the left for being on the wrong side. I voted for the Iron Dome funding. That funding was never intended to be enacted. Like, it wasn't going to go through the Senate. It was just a symbolic vote. Like, they already had $1 billion+. Like, they didn't need another $1 billion. It was, and that's why they picked that round number of $1 billion for the Iron Dome, to dare people to vote against it. And then if they vote against it, then use that against them. But it was just, and Hoyer said out loud, like, that the Israeli foreign minister wanted a vote to show the fealty of the U.S. Congress to Israel on these issues. Because at the time, I forget exactly what was going on. There was, there's a controversy every couple months about something that somebody said, and so they wanted to respond to that with this vote on the House floor to show that the House stands firmly with Israel, and so they picked the Iron Dome. But yeah, it's symbolic stuff rather than anything that's getting written into law.
I still contend that, I mean, but largely it has to do with, I think, the efficacy of this money. That we are 10 to 15 years out, where the Democratic Party is far more likely to make support of Israel, financial support, conditioned in some respect. But this money coming in really has changed the calculation in a lot of ways, I think, and we've seen this. Guys like Fetterman also, I think.
Fetterman let DMFI edit his position because he was facing, what was his name, Connor Lamb, very credible center-left establishment guy that with a couple $1 million can potentially win that primary. Connor Lamb was publicly begging for super PACs, if you remember, to come in. Like, they were putting out memos saying, like, we can win this, but we need a super PAC. If you're a super PAC, come on in. And so Fetterman, made the calculation that said, what is my position on aid, military aid, and conditioning, or and Mark Mellman told, I believe it was Jewish Insider in an interview, that his team was very generous and allowed us to make edits, and they accepted our edits, and so we didn't spend money against them.
And to be clear, the calculation here, and this is like sort of the ugly part of politics, and I guess people can just sort of decide, for themselves as to what the value is. But the calculation for a guy like Fetterman is like, my vote is not going to prevent this from happening.
Right.
And that's why, these votes by Jamal Bowman and those other 8 House people who voted against it, it's a pretty brave thing to do politically, because you're not going to get any material benefit out of it. The resolution itself wouldn't be binding in any real way whatsoever. It is, and you are theoretically, Jabal Momin gets voted out. We have one less vote for Medicare for all.
Yeah, and on top of that, the hardcore people who for them this is a single issue are probably not going to end up supporting him anyway, even though he voted against this resolution because of his Iron Dome vote. So, in some ways, it is extra brave because of that, because there's very little upside.
Right.
On the other side, and he said in an interview with me that ahead of that Iron Dome vote, he heard tons from people who wanted him to vote yes in his district, and zero from people who wanted him to vote no. So people on Twitter are asking a lot to do something that's could be politically damaging to you, despite the fact that there's no grassroots organizing going on to kind of support you if you do it.
And to be clear, from the perspective of a voter, you also got to be aware that it's not just a question of political damage. It is a damage that is to these other issues that you may or may not care about. Is really the point. All right, let's move on. I want to briefly talk about this. Just briefly get your speculation on this, and then let's talk about the lab leak, because you guys you wrote a piece the other day about the Republicans accidentally releasing information on the lab leak, and you guys have been on that beat for a bit, and I'm curious about it. But let's just first, before you came on, the Judge Cannon pushed. We now have the criminal trial of his stolen documents case taking place in May of 2024. This is in contrast to, I think, the Bragg one, which is in 2025. And is the Bragg one in 2025? Is that it? Do I have that right?
Right.
Nevertheless,
there's so many better ones. Just let that one go.
Wait, no, the Bragg one is in 2024. The Bragg one's in March 2024.
Oh, it's in March 2024.
If I'm not mistaken, or February.
March 25th, 24.
Okay. But the stolen documents one is a serious one that could actually send him to prison. I think the Bragg one may be one that he could I don't think
there's any prison
fine. Yeah,
associated
exactly.
with that. Yeah.
What do you? I mean, aside from the fact that there's obviously going to be attempts, and I imagine they might be successful to push it from May 2024. But I mean, this has been the big question, right? Like I have like two series of questions when people ask me who I think is going to win the election. Who's alive on November 6th of the candidates?
Key question.
And is Trump literally in prison at the time? But it doesn't seem like any of these cases. And this is a political question aside from like, yes, I think we should hold people accountable. And I think Trump should be in prison. But what are the implications of it? Or do you think there are any?
Well, so if you think about the Theranos lady, what was the gap between her conviction and her going to prison? Like long,
I mean,
right?
Enough
Right.
for her to have a kid, right? During that
And
time.
also to like develop relationships with journalists who
And, Amy Chozick, spending some quality time with Amy Chozick.
Right.
So
Yikes.
people, so what could also happen? Let's say, first of all, I suspect it gets delayed, but let's say it actually comes off in May. Let's say he gets convicted, because I mean, he did the stuff. And I think even like
he's admitted it in like 14 different venues.
And the American people are, I much prefer going after him over insurrection than this kind of thing. But the American people, I think, still have a lot of respect for the idea of the jury. And I think even Trump supporters, if they got on the jury and just looked at the evidence, you could be like, yeah, okay. I mean, he did this stuff. And so let's say he does get convicted. Then you ask for bail on appeal,
Right.
While you're awaiting sentencing. So you're out while you're awaiting sentencing, and you can also be out while you have live appeals, as long as you can keep the sentencing, keep punting it backwards. So I could imagine a world where even if he gets convicted, the sentencing and the appeal process keeps him free past the election.
And then he starts the new tradition of inaugural day pardons.
or he loses and goes to prison.
Right. Flies to whatever country he has tried to figure out where he could get asylum.
Yeah,
wouldn't that
where
be
would he
amazing?
go? Yeah.
Wouldn't that be amazing if he actually fled the country and sought asylum with
there's
Orban
Trump
or
Tower at Kazakhstan. There's Trump Towers all over the place.
Saudi Arabia, or whatever.
It's true. He could go. He could go
to Qatar, where he's building that golf course, and that's rife with corruption. I mean, he's got some really shady friends.
Is it unlikely that he hasn't sort of prepared for something like that?
I would think. I'm sure. He's such a
crazy person
who games things out all the time and has just crazy ideas that I'm sure he and Roger Stone or whoever.
There's got to be some bunker in some country that they've built where they're going to hide out before they can. I mean, but that should be interesting. All right, let's get to this lab leak thing. This has become. It's a strange story to me insofar as more like how it's being utilized than the story itself. I mean, as far as I know, there has been up until at least fairly recently no real evidence that there was a lab leak. It doesn't seem implausible in any way, but there hasn't been substantial evidence of a lab leak. Am I right or wrong about that?
Everything is just circumstantial. That's right. There's no smoking gun. There's no kind of mutation within COVID-19 that proves engineering or proves a lab, because this comes up.
Doesn't necessarily. I mean, if it's a lab leak, it doesn't necessarily have to be engineered either, does it?
Exactly. And so that comes up a ton in these new messages that the Republicans accidentally leaked that say all of this could be the product of natural evolution, but that natural evolution may have been hastened in a lab. In other words, you culture these viruses, you run them through basically mice over and over and over again, and you rapidly, rather than just allowing.
That's the so-called gain of function.
It doesn't necessarily have to be gain of function.
Oh, I see. Okay, could be just natural evolution, right? In fact, those are distinct things. Now this is coming back to me that one thing is sort of like we have this virus. Let's get a sense of how it's going to mutate in the future.
Right.
So that we can develop
through 10,000 mutations.
We can develop vaccines so that if it goes out into the wild and becomes a pandemic, we'll have a notion of where it's going so that we understand how this evolution works on some level.
That's right. And so in these messages, you keep having these scientists who in the very beginning are leaning toward lab escape, which it eventually
Who are these scientists? Tell us who are these scientists?
So you've got a crew of them. So the lead ones who go on to write this proximal origins paper, the paper that then Fauci cites in the White House, saying it was natural origin, and these scientists have just done that. Lead author on that is a guy named Dr. Christian Anderson. You also have Bob Gary from Tulane, Andrew Rambeau, and Eddie Holmes.
So these aren't government scientists. They're just a group of scientists who are in a network with each other. And when did they write this paper? When did they do this research?
So they had their conference call with Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and Fauci on February 1st. And on that conference call, they're all leaning lab leak. Something happened on that call that after that call, they sat down and wrote a first draft of the article that ended up being published in Nature Medicine. Nature actually rejected it. It ends up getting published in Nature Medicine as a preprint February, I think, 17th, and then as an actual article on March 17th, coming to the opposite conclusion that they had come to on the phone call. Conclusion is the wrong word, where they're leaning.
Right.
They said, well, we got some new data over that short amount of time, and that's why we changed our minds. What the new messages show is that well into the spring, they were still privately saying that they absolutely could not rule out a lab, and that a lot of them still thought a lab was actually more likely. And so there is the question, the empirical question of COVID's origin, which we're not really any closer to. But there's also the question of how did we set a narrative that became so partisan that for the first year and a half or so, everybody just kind of believed that science had proven that this was this was natural.
Let me ask you that though, because I mean, didn't they have that multi-year long report by what? It was the director of national intelligence, or the report that came out in late June, which essentially said that both theories are plausible, but the weight of the evidence was much more on the zoonosis theory, and they went through some of the kind of not allegations, but questions, including in November, the researchers having symptoms that could be associated with COVID, but could also be associated with cold or allergies or flu-like symptoms, that kind of thing. And like my gut feeling is that there's very little that in Washington there's consensus about, but hawkishness towards China is 100% bipartisan in a certain sense. So if there was evidence that was supporting the lab leak theory, my guess is that the intelligence report would be more willing to lend credence to that, given Washington's proclivities, as opposed to purely giving lip service to it in the report, and then the rest of the report being basically centered around the zoonosis theory.
But there was a statute that required them to release, to declassify all information around the lab leak related to Wuhan. All the information they had related to Wuhan. The statute explicitly said, we want the names of the researchers. We want what you know about date of onset. And it appeared that the people writing the statute, who have been doing this investigation, have access to classified information, and so know that they have these names. The Wall Street Journal has reported their names, and they wanted more details on this. And they just ignored the law and just said, yeah, it's true, actually, that there were some lab workers who got sick in the fall. Might have been COVID, might not have been COVID. And we're not going to tell you anything more. We're not going to tell you their names. The Wall Street Journal's reporting is that one of them was a top researcher, kind of the top guy who there are videos and photos of him doing extremely unsafe work in conditions that where virologists who are responsible look at that and are like, oh my God, that's horrifying. What are you doing? And the fact that you have a camera like recording you doing this. And then we have the Wall Street Journal saying that they got sick. You have a law saying, tell us these people's names. And instead they respond to the law by saying, yes, some people got sick, but they also had some non-COVID symptoms, which is what? I can't even think of what a non-COVID symptom is. COVID is such a wild across the spectrum kind of illness. So I'm not sure that whoever put out that report wanted to kind of slam the lab there. I think for whatever reason, they decided to put it out that way. The FBI was the FBI and the Department of Energy. So FBI has, enormous amounts of kind of resources at its disposal, and the Energy Department has the most scientists at its disposal. They both think, lab escape is more likely. Then you have others who say that zoonosis is
right.
Is
we
more,
should say
more,
the
more
FBI
likely.
one and the Department of Energy, I think, specifically said low confidence. But I mean, I don't know really what that means.
I think one of them was medium confidence. But then the question is, if that's the case, why for a year and a half were we led to believe that this was not an open question? And so that's why it's important to understand what happened on this conference call and what these scientists believed, because as you mentioned, there are scientists, but they're government funded scientists. But
I guess I would push back on the notion that it was in any way presented as something that was a closed case, because I just felt that, I think a majority of Americans believe the lab leak theory.
Well, they do now.
Yeah, but there's all the evidence that's cited is circumstantial, and so I think that would probably flies in the face, I guess, of the notion that it was presented as a open and shut case. I don't remember that being the case.
If you speculated about the question of whether or not there may have been a lab escape, as the origin of COVID on Facebook for close to 2 years, you would have your account taken down. Twitter wouldn't nuke your account, but was extremely restrictive on what you could say around that question. And that was coming from the NIH and coming from Fauci, who Fauci called it a conspiracy theory. And he pointed to this proximal origin paper to say that it was a conspiracy theory, when in fact they knew that it wasn't. It was very much an open question. And what drives me insane about this is because the reason I care so much about this is that Fauci is one of the most kind of aggressive supporters of gain of function research in the virology community. He gave this interview, I think 2012 or 2014, to an Australian newspaper where he was complaining about Obama, very rightly, putting a pause on gain of function research. And he was asked, like, what about the cost benefits here? Aren't you worried about the costs? And he said, this research is so valuable that I think it is worth the risk of a pandemic in order to go forward with this research. He also knew that he was funding some of this risky research through the NIH and through the NIAID at the Wuhan lab. Another guy who was on that call is this guy, Ron Fouchier, who's also close to virologist. Who's close to Fauci, who did this extraordinarily controversial research, gain of function research with bird flu, where he made bird flu, he basically turned it into something that could be transmissible by air to humans. And the rest of the virology community was like, dude, what are you doing?
Right. What's the value of that?
And there's this ideological cowboy component in the virology community that was very nervous that this was going to lead to some type of restrictions on gain of function research if people started looking too closely at this stuff. And as I've looked a lot more closely at this, and my colleague Mara Fissendahl over at The Intercept has done a lot of reporting about other lab accidents. Lab accidents happen, and it only has to happen once for the virus to get out and to create something cataclysmic that makes that we look back on this with nostalgia. And so that's what bothers me so much about the shutting down of the conversation around it, because it then lets people off the hook who have this ideological kind of drive to do this risky research that a lot of people just don't think actually is that useful. I think I have another story coming out. Let me find this good Christian Anderson quote on it. So this is from February. In February, in his messages, Christian Anderson is very nervous that Fauci is going to think that he's a, quote, crackpot who's opposed to gain of function research. Meanwhile, Anderson had an $8.9 million grant application sitting on Fauci's desk, and he's sharing his thoughts in a Slack message on gain of function research. He says, I'm all for gain of function experiments. I think they're really important. Then he puts an asterisk in his Slack message. And he says, I have evolved a bit on this point. Said, I used to think they're really important, but I'm actually not so sure anymore. I thought it was really important that we understood whether, for example, avian influenza could be transmissible between humans, and importantly, which steps and how many would need to be involved. But honestly, I'm not sure that type of knowledge is at all actionable, while, of course, being exceptionally dangerous. It only takes one mistake. And that's my problem with it, because they'll say, we need all this information, and that's why we need to do this risky research.
Right, but where's the cost-benefit analysis?
And also, what can you do with this information? Anderson's right. The Wuhan lab, the goal of the Wuhan lab was to detect and prevent future pandemics. At a bare minimum, even if you believe the zoonosis theory, a pandemic broke out a mile from it, and they didn't prevent it. So
whatever happened to the around that time, there was reporting as to both the diminishment of pandemic preparedness on a cabinet level under Trump, and diminishment of American observation in and around Wuhan, and I would imagine other areas in China. That was all cut. Do you remember any of that? Because it seems to have sort of that gone into the ether.
That was cut, and I think Fauci was able to use. Fauci, has been in the government for decades and was able to use kind of the new administration being less interested in gain of function research to kind of restart a lot of the funding that Obama, in the wake of the Ebola outbreak, had very smartly paused, and which I don't think, like, Obama doesn't get enough credit for that. Like he looked at both sides of the issue and came down and said, you know what, this is too risky. This is the benefit that we could potentially get out of this is totally theoretical. You're not telling me we can make viruses, we can make vaccines. Like we don't actually need to know this, and the cost is very clear. And he shut that down. And so then, right, that opened back up, and then you have Trump getting completely hostile with China constantly, and then shutting down pandemic preparedness. They had just zero plan.
So what is the motivation of the Republicans on this committee to not have released this information as opposed to accidentally releasing it? And I should also say, I just want to get back, in terms of like the Facebook stuff, it seems to me, and I really don't know about, I'm not even on Facebook really in any meaningful way. So I'm not really familiar with any of this.
I don't think anyone really is anymore.
When they censored that stuff, there's a difference, seems to me, between censoring, like, is this conclusive? Is this an open question, versus it's a lab leak based upon non-evidence, right? Because we still are, it seems to me, in an area where there is no evidence of a lab leak. We don't have a conclusive answer, but to the extent that there is evidence, and I wouldn't say there's a preponderance of evidence, but there's certainly a majority. I mean, to the extent that there is evidence, it's all on the zoolistic. I can't even know it. Zoonotic.
Oh, did I say it wrong?
No,
you got it right.
You said it right. Okay. I don't. After the third syllable, I don't hear anything.
Well, the evidence against it, though, is that it appears that it was already circulating in Wuhan before this outbreak. Like all of
is that true though? Is there evidence of that?
You had the what games you had, like international games in October in Wuhan, and you had a bunch of athletes go home with COVID, and so
did they go home with COVID in October?
I mean, how does it get to Italy? Yeah, you have a lot of reports of athletes going home with COVID. The original, like, the case keeps getting pushed back. So that part is problematic. Like the timeline of the Wuhan market. Wuhan market appears to be more of a super spreader. That doesn't mean it's a lab. It could have been somewhere else. But they also have traced every single animal sold at that wet market all the way back to their farms. They've slaughtered an ungodly number of animals, searching
and who's
for
they? The Chinese?
The Chinese, yeah. In collaboration with the WHO, because they're happy to collaborate in attempts to prove that it was a natural origin, and so there has been real research done in trying to find the intermediate species, and the idea that, let's say it's a raccoon dog or whatever, like the idea that a raccoon dog could have then given it to humans in the market, but then you can't find any other raccoon dog anywhere ever who's had it, is evidence that you need to keep hunting until you find something. But they, like I said, they've slaughtered animals all across the area and haven't found one yet.
All right. So, but fair enough. But we still haven't said evidence of a lab leak, right? I mean, we're there. I mean, again, I'm agnostic, really, about this, and I think, more importantly, we need more controls, regardless. I mean, it doesn't. That to me.
I mean,
seems...
the best, for people who aren't following it, the best evidence that you would have is circumstantial evidence that there was a grant application made to DARPA to create a virus that would basically have been able to create a SARS-CoV-2. Which was not funded, which the EcoHealth Alliance, the organization that applied for it, says they didn't do the research, but they don't know. Like, they don't have full access to the Wuhan lab. Once they had, usually you do some of the research, ahead of a grant application. And they also had, we know, the Wuhan lab has financing that is independent of the NIH. It's not just the NIH that's funding this lab. So they could have done that work. There's also this very COVID close 2012 Mayan virus that was being researched on in the lab, and it doesn't have to have been gain of function. It could have just been just normal virological research that just slipped out. Probably also a good idea not to have these labs in a city of 20 million people.
Well,
just in general, even if it didn't come from the lab.
Yeah, I guess that cuts both ways, right? I mean, because my understanding is that these labs exist all around the biggest cities in China, specifically because you want some close proximity to where a pandemic may take place. I'm not, I don't know. I don't know about the theory about that. So with all that said, what is happening? Is there any sort of like reassertion of the controls that existed prior to Trump's administration?
The House passed, and maybe it'll get through the Senate as part of the NDAA, restrictions on, in particular, the Wuhan Lab and EcoHealth Alliance, and some other foreign funding of labs. But it really has to be an international convention, because, okay, you stop one lab from doing this risky research, and you just do it somewhere else. And it's not as if it leaks out of a lab in Sudan, that it can't ever get over to the United States or anywhere else. So there hasn't been a whole lot of movement in that direction, and part of it, it's just such a partisan. It's become caught up in it. It should be. You would think it'd be the kind of thing that Democrats would be supportive of, because it's government regulation for public safety. It's weird that it's kind of Republicans leading the way on that, and they're not serious about it. So therefore, it's not going to.
Right.
I mean, is that holistic policy?
Why did those Slack thing, like the piece that you wrote outlines how these scientists, despite having put out a paper where their speculation was that it was
natural
zoonotic, yes, natural versus a lab leak, but they were still talking about the lab leak in private. Why did that leak out? Why didn't the Republicans?
And so this is a good tip if you're ever producing a report. And we had one of our tech guys had actually written a story on this a couple of years ago that they clearly didn't read. If you're making a Word document and you crop an image, you then have to take extra steps when you kind of produce your final document, or else you can, if you're smart and know how to do it, I had to get help. You click on the image, and it gives you the entire image.
You can revert back to the original thing. Like it almost works on your iPhone in the same way. If you crop an image, there's still the information that is outside the crop. Well, I get that, but what I don't understand is like why weren't they?
Yeah, idiots. It's like
no.
Yeah,
I'm not asking why they made the mistake that made it possible to leak.
No. Why didn't they release it like during the hearing when they had the guys right in front of them?
That's my thing is like they're desperate to attack Biden on China. If this, I think, information was as revelatory, my guess is that they would have leaked it on purpose or used it to a political benefit.
I think that they were holding it for some grand finale. Yeah. And that maybe they were lining up it with Fox News or somebody who was going to do like a definitive like piece. I don't think their preference was that it like
comes out and
guy on Twitter and then a guy on the Intercept.
How did you know to do that? Do you always, like everyone else, see a picture now?
I wish I could remember his Twitter handle now, but a guy on Twitter just knew how to do that, and that night was like going through the PDF and was tweeting out some of it. And so I saw his thread and flagged it for our IT guy, or one, who was like, oh wow, they didn't read our story on this. And he was very quickly able to export everything and get it into a zip file, which was great, because then quickly after that, Republicans took it back down. But now it's out. Since then, they seem to have leaked all of it now to Taibbi and Schellenberger, like even more than they had accidentally leaked. Because the only things that we got were stuff where they had cropped something else. But there's a lot of pages where they didn't crop anything, so we didn't get those.
So they gave the rest of the story to Schellenberger and Taibbi.
What it looks like, yeah. And maybe they were planning on giving them all of it at some point.
Why don't you give it to the Wall Street Journal?
Maybe they were. Like, if I were them, I'd give it to the Wall Street Journal. Like, that's your most respectable kind of.
Well, it's also like the Substacks, like you're gonna, like, if it's really, I mean, presumably there's some element of this is in the public interest from their perspective, and you would think you'd want it widely disseminated as opposed to, like, I don't know if Schellenberger has a Substack or just a Twitter feed.
It's not going to break through in the same way that it's
Substack.
the journal does it. Yeah.
Well, Ryan Grimm, interesting. Appreciate you coming on and talking about that piece, among other things. I'm sure it's going to generate a little bit of controversy around here, but it's interesting.
People
should ask themselves why. Like, why?
Well,
why
Ryan,
are they partisan about this?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that I think I'm not trying. I don't think it's partisan, but I do appreciate whenever you come on. You're my favorite person to disagree with because it's always the most good faith disagreements. So much appreciated about that, Ryan.
Yeah, and I think someone made a point on here that that in the context when this began, when the theory of the lab leak was considered to be misinformation. And still we're 2 years out, 3 years out. We still have no evidence of a lab leak. It's possible. I mean, we also, it's more possible, it seems to me, than aliens coming down and generating this virus. Definitely more possible. We don't necessarily have evidence. Any more evidence of that happening.
And you see messages from these scientists early on that say that if this was a lab leak, there will never be evidence. Like, there just won't be.
And
so therefore, let's avoid the fact that it might have been.
Well, I mean, if that's the case,
the virus is
then it becomes like, more of a public policy question. If we can never resolve this issue in that environment that was taking place, where you're having people, being beat up because they were, of, some Asian descent. I mean, and it was being used as a jumping off point of it, like, because if it was a question of a lab leak as opposed to, like, this has been developed as a bioweapon, let's say, which is
kind of virus.
Yeah.
The Wuhan, what was he calling it?
Wuhan flu.
Trump called it Kung flu at one point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I can understand why, in the absence of evidence, there would be some sense of, like, this is a public policy question. I mean, even the government didn't do this. Facebook did it, and it was their sort of like forward, public policy. That, I think that explanation is not that hard for me to understand, that people have that perspective on it.
Right, but also because they had that paper in Nature Medicine that they could point to.
Say that it
was natural. Like, you had, like, I understand, like, that's where I was, because I read that paper and I'm like, oh, these guys know this more than I know it. They say this.
It's not to be fair, it's also not the only paper, right? There's like 4 or 5
paper.
What's that?
It was the key paper. Yeah.
At that time.
Yeah.
All right. Fair enough. Ryan Grimm, I'm glad you're unrepentant.
That's right. Always. Never repent.
Appreciate your time.
You got it.
Thanks, Ryan.